It was a warm, sunny afternoon when Emma Reynolds walked into the airport holding her little son's tiny hand. She was tired but excited. Emma, a single mother, worked hard every day to provide for her son. Today, they were traveling to visit her parents, who hadn't seen their grandson in months. She had planned this trip carefully, saving money and booking tickets weeks in advance. Everything was supposed to go smoothly. The airport was buzzing with people rushing to catch their flights. Emma juggled a heavy diaper bag on one shoulder and carried a small backpack with snacks, toys, and essentials for her son. "Stay close to me, sweetie," she told her son gently as he skipped happily beside her, unaware of the long journey ahead. When they finally reached the boarding gate, Emma felt a wave of relief. Soon, they would be on the plane, and she could relax. The boarding line was long, but Emma smiled politely at the other passengers. She didn't mind waiting. Her son tugged at her hand, asking questions about the plane, and she answered each one with patience. "Do planes fly above the clouds, Mommy?" he asked with wide, curious eyes. "They sure do, honey. You'll see. It'll be like riding on a big bird," Emma said with a chuckle, ruffling his hair. When their turn came, Emma handed her boarding passes to the flight attendant. She smiled warmly, trying to appear as calm and organized as possible. "Hi, our seats are in row 14, she said. Her son clung to her leg, shyly looking up at the tall flight attendant. The flight attendant was a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. She took the tickets from Emma and scanned them. Emma waited, expecting the usual polite nod and instructions on where to go. But instead, the woman paused. She looked at Emma, then at her son, and then back at the tickets in her hand. "I don't think the seat is for you," the flight attendant said. Her voice was calm but cold, like she was sure Emma had done something wrong. Emma blinked, confused. "I'm sorry. These are our seats. Row 14, she said, her voice steady but polite. The attendant's lips curled slightly, almost like a smirk. "Are you sure? Let me check again," she said, tapping at her screen. The pause felt like forever. Passengers behind Emma started to shuffle impatiently, whispering among themselves. Emma could feel their eyes on her. "I booked these seats weeks ago," Emma said softly, trying not to cause a scene. Her son tugged at her hand again, looking up at her with innocent eyes, not understanding why they weren't moving forward. The flight attendant sighed loudly, like Emma was a problem she didn't want to deal with. "Step aside for now. I'll need to double-check," she said, motioning for Emma to move out of the way. Emma's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She stepped to the side, holding her son close. People continued boarding, brushing past her without a second glance. Her mind raced. What could be wrong? She knew she had done everything right. The tickets were real, and she had paid for them with her hard-earned money. She crouched down to her son's level and smiled to reassure him. "It's okay, sweetie. We're just waiting for them to fix something," she said, even though her heart felt heavy. He nodded, trusting her completely. The minutes ticked by, and Emma began to feel more uncomfortable. Other passengers passed without any trouble. Families with kids, older couples, and businessmen all waved through without a second glance. Why was she being stopped? Emma's thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendant returned. Her expression hadn't softened. "I've checked again, and there might be an issue with your booking. We'll have to see if we can accommodate you," she said, her tone making Emma feel like she had done something wrong. "But these are my seats." "I have the confirmation email," Emma said, her voice still polite but firmer now. She wasn't someone who liked conflict, but she also knew when to stand up for herself. The flight attendant raised an eyebrow. "Let me talk to someone about it," she said and walked away without another word. Emma stood there, holding her son tightly. She could feel the tension building in her chest. Why was this happening? She thought about her parents waiting eagerly for them on the other side. She thought about all the sacrifices she had made to afford this trip. Passengers nearby started to notice what was going on. A man sitting near the boarding gate frowned as he watched. A woman with her own child whispered to her husband, glancing at Emma with a look of concern. Emma could feel their eyes, but no one spoke up. She took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. "Mommy will fix this," she whispered to her son, who was now leaning against her leg, looking sleepy. Little did Emma know, this moment was only the beginning of what would become a journey she would never forget. Emma's heart sank like a stone in water. Her face grew warm, and her hands tightened around her son's tiny fingers. The flight attendant didn't even bother to explain why they couldn't sit. She simply waved Emma aside, like she was asking her to get out of the way. "Step over here, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice flat and cold, as if Emma was causing a problem. Emma's cheeks burned, but she held her head high. She didn't want to let her son see how upset she was. "There must be a mistake," Emma said, trying to keep her voice calm. Inside, her chest felt tight, and her mind raced with questions. "I booked these seats weeks ago," she explained, holding up the boarding passes again. Her voice trembled just a little, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had done everything right. Why was this happening? The flight attendant didn't even look at the boarding passes this time. She shook her head, her lips curving into a small smirk. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that made Emma feel small, as though the woman thought she was lying or didn't belong there. "I'll have to check with someone else," the attendant said in a dismissive tone. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing there, frozen in place. Emma looked down at her son, who clung to her leg with wide, curious eyes. "What's wrong, Mommy?" he asked softly, his voice full of innocence. "Nothing, sweetheart," Emma replied, forcing a smile. "We just need to wait a little bit." But inside, she felt a knot of anger and embarrassment growing. As she waited, Emma noticed something. Other passengers were being waved through without any problems. They handed over their boarding passes, got a quick nod from the flight attendants, and walked onto the plane. No delays. No questions. Emma's eyes darted from one passenger to the next. Families with kids. Couples. Business travelers. They all went through easily. Then something hit her, a sinking feeling that made her stomach churn. None of them looked like her. None of them had her dark skin or curly hair. Her throat tightened. Could that be the reason? No, she told herself. That couldn't be it. She didn't want to believe it. But the thought wouldn't leave her mind. Passengers behind Emma began to shift impatiently. She could feel their eyes on her. A few people whispered to each other, glancing at her as if she had done something wrong. Her hands felt clammy, and she gripped her son's hand a little tighter. Minutes passed, and the flight attendant didn't return. Emma stood there, trying to stay calm, but every second felt like an hour. Her son tugged at her hand, looking up at her with confusion. "Mommy, when can we sit down?" he asked. "Soon, baby." "Very soon," Emma replied, stroking his hair. She hoped her voice sounded steady, even though her heart was pounding. She hated that they had to stand there, waiting like this, as if they didn't belong. Finally, Emma saw the flight attendant walking back toward them. She felt a flicker of hope, thinking that maybe everything would be sorted out now. But the woman's face didn't look apologetic. It looked annoyed, like Emma was a problem she wished would just go away. "I'm still checking," the attendant said curtly, not even stopping to explain further. "You'll need to wait here a bit longer." Emma's stomach sank again. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped herself. What could she even say? She didn't want to make a scene, not with her son right there. She glanced at the boarding line again. More passengers filed past, barely sparing her a glance. A few people did look, though some with curiosity, others with pity. One older man sitting near the boarding gate watched the whole thing unfold. He frowned, shaking his head slightly. A young woman with a baby strapped to her chest whispered something to the man next to her, glancing at Emma with concern. Emma caught the woman's gaze for a moment, but the stranger quickly looked away. Emma felt tears sting the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. And definitely not in front of her son. She crouched down to his level and gave him a reassuring smile. "Mommy's going to fix this, okay? Don't worry," she said softly. He nodded, trusting her completely. His innocent faith made her chest ache. She wished she could protect him from moments like this forever. But Emma couldn't stop her mind from spinning. What if they didn't let her on the plane? What if they missed their flight? What if they had to stay here, stranded in the airport, with no way to get to her parents? She thought about calling someone for help, but who? She didn't know anyone at the airline. And even if she did, would they care? She felt so alone in that moment, standing there with her son in the middle of a busy airport, surrounded by people who didn't know her story and probably didn't care. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice. "Excuse me," a man said. Emma turned to see the older man who had been watching earlier. He stood up and walked over to her, his face serious. "Is everything okay?" he asked gently, his voice low so as not to draw too much attention. Emma hesitated. Should she tell him? She didn't want to seem like she was complaining. But at the same time, she felt like she was drowning and needed anyone to throw her a lifeline. "They said there's a problem with my seats," Emma said finally, keeping her voice calm. "But I don't understand what's wrong. I booked them weeks ago." The man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Seems strange," he said, glancing at the flight attendant who was now talking to another staff member. "I've been watching. They didn't stop anyone else like this." Emma felt a lump in her throat but didn't say anything. She just nodded. "Hang in there," the man said. "Don't let them push you around." His words were simple, but they gave Emma a little bit of strength. She straightened up and held her son's hand tighter. Whatever happened next, she wasn't going to back down. She had every right to be on that plane, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel otherwise. As she stood there, waiting for the flight attendant to return yet again, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a mistake with her tickets. Something deeper was going on, and she wasn't sure how it would end. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. Emma stood her ground, even though her legs ached from holding her son and standing still for so long. The flight attendant had not returned yet, and the weight of the situation pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. Her son, now sitting on the floor beside her, played with the edge of her dress, unaware of the tension in the air. Emma glanced at the crowd. People were staring at her, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She could hear faint whispers here and there, but she kept her focus on staying calm. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the counter where the flight attendant had been before. A younger attendant now stood there, typing on a computer. "Excuse me," Emma said firmly but politely. "I'd like to know what's going on with my seats. I paid for them, and I just want to get to row 14 with my son." The young attendant looked up briefly, her expression unsure. "I'm not sure, ma'am. The senior flight attendant is handling your case. You'll need to wait for her," she said, before quickly looking back at her screen. "But I've already been waiting," Emma said, her voice steady. She wasn't going to yell, but she wasn't going to stay quiet, either. "Can you at least tell me why there's a problem?" Everyone else is boarding without an issue. The younger woman glanced around nervously, as if worried someone might overhear. I don't know, she stammered. Please just wait. Emma stepped back, frustrated but determined. She returned to her spot near the boarding line, her son now leaning sleepily against her leg. She stroked his hair and whispered, "It'll be okay, baby. Mommy's going to fix this." Just then, Emma caught the eye of a man sitting nearby. He was older, with silver hair and kind eyes. He'd been watching quietly for some time. Now, he gave her a small nod, as if to say, "I see you." That small gesture filled Emma with a tiny spark of hope. Maybe not everyone was ignoring what was happening. The murmurs around her grew louder. A woman a few rows back leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Why are they making her wait? Everyone else is getting through just fine." Another passenger, a younger man with a backpack slung over one shoulder, frowned and muttered, "This doesn't seem right." Emma could feel the energy in the room shifting. People were starting to notice. It wasn't just her anymore. She wasn't invisible. Finally, a voice broke through the growing hum of whispers. "Hey, isn't this unfair?" someone said loudly. Emma turned to see a woman with curly hair and a bold expression standing a few feet away. She had been quiet before, but now she looked angry. "She's been standing there forever." "What's the problem?" the woman continued, directing her words toward the counter. Emma's heart lifted slightly. Someone was speaking up for her. The flight attendant returned just then, her face tight with irritation. She glanced at the woman who had spoken out but didn't address her. Instead, she turned to Emma, her tone sharp. "Ma'am, we're still trying to figure this out. You'll need to stay to the side." "I've been waiting," Emma said, her voice calm but unwavering. "And no one is telling me why. I just want to sit in the seats I paid for." The flight attendant narrowed her eyes, clearly annoyed. "We're doing our best, ma'am. You need to be patient." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another passenger chimed in. "Why does she need to be patient?" It was the man with the backpack. He stepped forward, looking straight at the flight attendant. "She has her ticket. She paid for her seats. What's the holdup?" The flight attendant looked startled, clearly not expecting to be challenged. She stammered for a moment before saying, "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "Actually, it kind of does," the man said. "We're all watching this, and it looks really bad. Why is she being treated like this?" More murmurs spread through the boarding area. Emma's cheeks flushed, but this time it wasn't just embarrassment, it was a mix of relief and gratitude. People were noticing. People cared. The older man with the kind eyes stood up now, his voice calm but firm. "She's right," he said, nodding toward Emma. "This isn't fair. I've been watching, and no one else has been treated this way." The flight attendant's face turned red. She looked around, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of her control. Emma stood taller, feeling a newfound strength in the support of the passengers around her. "I have my ticket," Emma said, holding it up for everyone to see. Her voice was steady, her shoulders back. "I paid for these seats. I just want to sit down with my son. That's all." A ripple of agreement swept through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Let her on the plane." Another person said, "This is ridiculous." The flight attendant hesitated, her confidence clearly shaken. "Let me talk to my supervisor," she said quickly before walking away again. As she left, the curly-haired woman stepped closer to Emma. "You're handling this so well," she said softly. "I would have lost it by now." Emma smiled faintly, her eyes misty. "Thank you," she said. "I just want to get on the plane." The minutes dragged on, but now the air felt different. Emma wasn't alone anymore. People were watching, speaking up, and standing with her. She held her son's hand tightly, whispering, "Almost there, baby. Almost there." Little did she know, this moment was just the beginning of something much bigger. The tension in the air was thick as Emma stood waiting, holding her son close. She didn't know what else to do. The whispers around her grew louder. People were watching now, their eyes flicking between Emma and the flight attendants. It felt like the whole world was waiting for something to happen. Then, suddenly, a tall figure in a crisp uniform stepped forward. It was the pilot. His presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere. He had an air of calm authority, the kind that made people sit up straighter and pay attention. His hat was tilted perfectly, and his sharp eyes scanned the room. He had clearly heard about the situation and decided to step in. "What's going on here?" the pilot asked, his voice steady but firm. He looked directly at the flight attendant who had been causing the delay. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight, like he expected an honest answer right away. The flight attendant, the same one who had smirked at Emma earlier, seemed to shrink under his gaze. She fidgeted with the papers in her hand, her confidence slipping for the first time. "There seems to be an issue with her tickets," she said, her voice not as strong as before. "I'm trying to resolve it." The pilot raised an eyebrow. "What kind of issue?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. He wasn't letting this go. The flight attendant hesitated, stumbling over her words. "Well, I thought there might be a mistake. Maybe she's in the wrong seat, or something," she said, glancing around nervously. It was clear she wasn't sure what to say anymore. The pilot's sharp eyes narrowed slightly, and he nodded thoughtfully. He turned to Emma, his expression softening. "Ma'am," he said kindly, "I'm sorry for the trouble. Let's get this sorted out right now." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was listening, someone who had the authority to make things right. "Thank you," she said quietly, holding her son's hand tightly. The pilot pulled out a small tablet and began tapping on the screen. His fingers moved quickly as he searched for Emma's name and seat assignment. The room grew quiet, everyone watching him intently. Even the passengers who had been whispering earlier were silent now. A few moments later, the pilot's face changed. His brows furrowed, and his mouth tightened. He looked up from the tablet, his expression serious. "It seems your seats are exactly where you said they are," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "There's no mistake here." Emma's heart jumped. She had been right all along. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't wrong. The pilot looked back at the flight attendant, his tone firm now. "Please explain to me why this passenger and her child were delayed," he said. The flight attendant's face turned red. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, as if she couldn't find the right words. Her earlier confidence was completely gone. She glanced around nervously, avoiding eye contact with the pilot. "Ma'am," the pilot said to Emma, his voice calm again, "I apologize for the inconvenience. Please follow me. Let's get you and your son to your seats." Emma nodded, holding her son close as she followed the pilot down the aisle. The passengers watching from their seats gave her small smiles and nods of encouragement. She felt her chest swell with relief and gratitude. But just as she reached row 14, the pilot stopped and turned back toward the flight attendant, who was still standing near the boarding gate. His voice was firm, and his words cut through the air like a blade. "We'll have to talk about this after the flight." The room went completely silent. The passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, and Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The flight attendant's face turned pale. She nodded quickly, her mouth set in a tight line. Emma didn't know exactly what the pilot meant, but she knew it was serious. It felt like a small victory, a moment where justice was finally served. As she and her son settled into their seats, Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of relief and gratitude. Her son looked up at her, his small hand resting on hers. "Are we going to fly now, Mommy?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "Yes, baby," Emma said, kissing his forehead. "We're finally going to fly." Passengers around her gave her quiet nods of support. Some even clapped softly, though they quickly stopped, not wanting to draw too much attention. Emma smiled at them, her heart swelling with appreciation. For the first time that day, she felt seen, heard, and respected. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Emma glanced out the window, the clouds rolling in the distance. She thought about everything that had happened. She had stood her ground. She hadn't let herself be pushed aside or ignored. And, most importantly, her son had seen her fight for what was right. The pilot's words echoed in her mind, "We'll have to talk about this after the flight." Whatever happened next, Emma knew that this was more than just a small moment on a plane. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about claiming your seat, it's about showing others that they can't treat people unfairly and get away with it. And as the plane soared into the sky, Emma held her son's hand and smiled. They were finally on their way home. As the flight attendant's face turned red and her confidence faded, it was clear to everyone that her actions had been noticed. The pilot's stern words had shaken her, and the quiet support of the passengers around Emma made it obvious that the situation would not be ignored. Emma, now finally sitting in her rightful seat, felt a wave of relief wash over her. She gently helped her son buckle his seat belt, his curious eyes scanning the plane's interior. He seemed excited again, his earlier confusion forgotten. "Mommy, is the plane going to fly now?" he asked softly, tugging at her sleeve. "Yes, baby," Emma replied with a warm smile. "We're finally ready." Around her, passengers exchanged approving looks and murmurs of support. A kind-looking woman sitting in the row behind leaned forward and tapped Emma gently on the shoulder. "You did great," she whispered, sliding a small bag of crackers onto Emma's tray table. "Here, for your little one. I'm so glad you stood up for yourself." Emma's cheeks flushed, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. She smiled back at the woman, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you so much," she said softly. Her son beamed as she handed him the crackers, his small hands eagerly opening the bag. The plane soon took off, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Emma gazed out the window as the clouds passed by, her mind racing with everything that had happened. She felt proud of herself for not backing down, but she also felt tired. She hoped that the situation would end here and she could put it behind her. When the plane finally landed, Emma felt her body relax for the first time all day. Passengers began gathering their belongings, some casting warm glances in her direction. She didn't know these people, but their quiet support had meant everything to her during such a difficult moment. As Emma and her son stood to leave, a flight attendant, this time a younger one with kind eyes, approached her. "Ma'am, could you wait a moment before heading to baggage claim? Some of our airline representatives would like to speak with you," she said gently. Emma hesitated, her stomach tightening. "What now?" She nodded and held her son's hand as they waited. Other passengers filed out of the plane, some giving her encouraging nods or small smiles as they passed. The older man with the silver hair, who had spoken up earlier, patted her shoulder as he walked by. "You're stronger than you think," he said with a wink. When the last passenger had disembarked, two airline representatives in formal uniforms boarded the plane. Their faces were serious but polite. One of them, a woman with a clipboard, stepped forward. "Ms. Reynolds?" she asked. "Yes, that's me," Emma replied, feeling her nerves rise. "First, let me start by apologizing for what happened earlier," the woman said, her voice calm and professional. "We've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that you were treated unfairly." We are deeply sorry for the inconvenience and distress this caused you and your child. Emma nodded, unsure of what to say. The other representative, a tall man, spoke next. The airline does not tolerate discrimination or unprofessional behavior from any of our staff, he said firmly. The incident is being investigated, and appropriate actions will be taken. Emma glanced at her son, who was busy playing with a small toy in his hand, unaware of the seriousness of the conversation. She felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The woman with the clipboard nodded. "We completely understand, and we appreciate your patience and strength during this ordeal. To make up for what happened, we'd like to offer you and your son vouchers for a free flight anywhere our airline travels. Additionally, we'll be refunding the cost of your tickets." Emma was taken aback. She hadn't expected